Good morning to everyone who's joined. Thank you so much for spending the time. And I'm delighted to be talking to you today about how we can look at our meetings and event space and looking at driving more revenue and making the most of our function space. So the topic that we're covering today is really looking at our common challenges within the industry, understanding some of the concepts of meetings and events revenue management, and learning the best practices and how we can leverage some of the opportunities that are available in the marketplace. I've spent many years working with meetings and events and come across many challenges working with hotels and independent conference centers. And one of the challenges, I think one of the key things that comes up frequently as I speak with clients is we don't tend to focus a lot of our attention on filling our meeting rooms. Particularly within the hotel world, we spend a lot of time and focus and attention on filling bedrooms, and we have a lot of tools available to do that. But sometimes the meeting space gets left behind a little bit, and that can create challenges in having unsold meeting space or undersold function space. Having groups driving a lot of the demand, looking at how we can fill our bedrooms, and therefore some of the meeting space often gets sold to smaller groups or is just not used effectively, and getting that balance between group business and catering business. And sometimes we leave it very late because we're waiting for those big residential events, and we leave it quite late to fill what's left of our space, and sometimes turn away some great opportunities because we're not quite sure when that demand is going to come. So those are some of the outcomes of not having some great systems and processes in managing our meetings and event space. I'd just like to take a little bit of a poll from all of you who have joined today to just get a feeling of what are some of your key challenges in strategically managing the meetings and events business. And you'll see on your dashboard, Wayman's going to open the poll and manage the poll. And we'd just like you to take a quick selection of, we've predetermined a few answers for you, so take a quick selection of just one of those answers that most applies to you. So what are your challenges that you're facing in your business? Is it that it's difficult to get good data from the sales and catering or diary management system that you're using? Is it that there's no easy tools available to help you with that analysis? Very often we can spend a lot of time working with Excel spreadsheets and rekeying data, and it can be very time consuming and therefore not so effective. Is it that your meetings event space isn't given commercial priority? Is it that there's a lot of focus on other aspects of the business, such as the bedrooms, and therefore there isn't the focus and attention on driving revenues from the meetings and event space? Is it perhaps a lack of skills and support for that area of the business? Or is it that because there's no real strong industry standards driving key performance indicators, that sometimes it's difficult to know what to focus on and how to make those improvements in the business? So please just take a few selections on the poll. The poll is now open. We're just going to take a couple of minutes for you to make your selections. You can see those answers growing there as we're moving through. And then we'll just get some feedback from Wayman when we've got most of the responses in. Okay, that's looking a good response. Wayman, do you want to give us some feedback on the poll result?
Yep, we just closed the poll and the results should be shown on the screen for everybody. You can just go through the results, Heather.
That's great. Okay, fantastic. So very interestingly, what we can see is the winner, if you like, or the most popular answer is there's no easy tool available to help with analysis. So a lot of that work is done manually, as say through either Excel spreadsheets or perhaps not at all, because there's nothing easy out there to be able to get that data. The second highest there was it's difficult to get good data from sales and catering systems, and I think that applies. There's many good diary management systems available. Obviously, there's a few of the market leaders, but one thing that they do all have in common is they're not great at providing good commercial reporting and the sort of things that we want to know on a daily basis. And then we have a fairly even between no industry standards at 36%, and lack of skills and support at 31%. And then finally, it's really not given as much commercial priority, which actually got a very high 28% of the poll. So significant, there's a significant a gap in the industry of really being focused on our commercial returns from our meetings and event space. Well, thank you very much for that input, and we'll touch back on some of those results as we go through the presentation. So why is our meetings and event space so neglected? We've touched on some of those key points. One of the key things is that our revenue management processes and knowledge, we're very, very good at applying that to our bedroom management. But very often the skills and the analytics that apply in that area are really not available and not applied in the meeting space. There's very few KPIs, as we just mentioned. So knowing exactly what to measure and how to apply them is not easily available. There's not much engagement from the revenue managers within the business into the meetings and events side. It's often seen as very operational, or comes under the sales team, and isn't really something, again, possibly because of a lack of data, that revenue managers actually actively engage in. That's starting to change in the industry, I've noticed, but there's still quite a gap between those two areas of the business. As we've mentioned, difficulty accessing good data, time-consuming reporting, and meetings and events is often that second best, is seen as secondary to the focus on the bedroom sales. We touched on exactly in the survey, so no really good tools available for helping to manage that meetings and event space. There's no good forecasting tools. It's difficult to track those demand fluctuations. And consequently, we get a lack of confidence in our decision making about meetings and events. We tend to take pieces of business and make decisions because we're really not quite sure what the alternative is. So we're not very confident, and so we end up erring on the side of caution and taking business that perhaps we later regret. And likewise, there's no real clear performance measurement of how we're doing. Often that's only, did we make budget, as opposed to having some really good key measures of how the whole business is performing. So where do we go? What are the biggest problems? Identifying, we tend, I think, to look a lot at the operational challenges of meetings and events rather than the commercial challenges. So identifying where those problems are, knowing how to fix them, and knowing where to start is often one of the challenges. And hopefully throughout this webinar, we'll answer some of those questions for you. The key thing is it's not really all about technology. It's very important to have a combination of good tools and good systems, but also good people and good process. All of those things go together, and you can't really have one without the other. We have a great quote here from our founder and president of Ideas. Effective revenue management and pricing can only be achieved through the optimal alignment of people and process and technology capabilities. And that's very, very true throughout many aspects of the businesses that we manage, but it's definitely true in the meetings and events area of the business. So I just want to take you through a little bit of the principles of revenue management that we so easily apply and talk about through managing particularly the bedroom side of the business, but also in other industries such as airlines and so forth. You'll have heard these key concepts of right product and right customer, selling at the right time and the right price through the right channels. Those are things that we talk about a lot very naturally in certain aspects of the business. But our challenge is, how can we apply some of that strategic revenue management principle to the management of our meetings and event space? So the first thing we really have to identify is, can we revenue manage our meetings and event space? Does it really qualify in the way that we think about revenue management. And these are just some of the key principles that are necessary for space to be yieldable. Number one at the top there, fixed capacity. Well, we have fixed capacity of our function rooms, not so much from our delegate capacities, but in terms of the number and the amount of function space we have, our square meterage is fixed. Just in the same way as our number of bedrooms or airline seats are fixed, we can't suddenly grow that space when we have higher demand. We know we have advanced reservation patterns, so bookings are often made a long way in advance. Lead times across the globe tend to be getting smaller and smaller, but we can measure that, so we can gauge that level of demand and measure how far in advance certain types of business are going to book. The inventory is most definitely perishable. If we didn't sell that function room yesterday, we can't resell it. The opportunity has gone. Very much a key aspect of being able to yield manage and revenue manage that space. Definitely fluctuating demand. We can see that through the use of our space, that we have very high peaks and low troughs. And we can also segment the business, lots of different types of business. We can look at that for our banqueting business, for meetings and events and exhibitions, for training and various different ways of breaking down those social events. And we can look at all of the different characteristics and aspects of each of those segments. And we do have low variable costs attached. So very definitely across all of those principles, it should be fairly straightforward to manage our meeting space in that way. It does, however, rely on having good information. These are some of the aspects that we need to affect within our business in order to reach that goal of having good meeting strategy. Number one, in the bottom right hand corner there, you can see sales and catering data quality. And this is one of the biggest challenges hotels face and conference centres, of capturing data accurately and effectively. Very often we don't put all bookings in the system, or perhaps they don't all have revenue attached to them, or perhaps they're miscoded. And the quality of data in our sales and catering systems is not always helpful when it comes to trying to analyze that data and use it strategically. We've talked a little bit about meetings and events metrics, having ways of measuring our opportunities, and we'll come back to some of the opportunities and some of the metrics that are available beyond just achieving budget. And once we can break those metrics down, we can really start to see how well we can achieve certain aspects of the business. Meetings and events revenue management ownership. One of the really important things to make this work effectively is to bridge that gap between the sales and catering elements of the business and the revenue management side. We have great revenue managers with fantastic analytical skills, and we have great catering managers with fantastic sales and catering knowledge. And bringing those two together would really start to improve our knowledge and understanding and abilities in managing the business more effectively. Demand-based forecasting is something that is still very difficult within meetings and events. With bedrooms, it's a lot more straightforward, but as we know, with meetings and events, there's so many facets to do with how we measure demand. There's a lot more churn. People hold space in the diary that isn't necessarily going to materialize. We work through a lot of third parties. We have lots of different types of business and lots of different sizes, and all of those sort of aspects of having large events that take lots of breakout areas versus selling those areas to smaller independent bookings, and at what point should we do that? It's a very complex thing to master, and so we're not very good at accurately forecasting our demand, and having the tools to do that would obviously be a great step in the right direction. Revenue management for maximizing profits. Profit is something that has started to become more and more a focus at the point of taking an inquiry. Hotels have always thought obviously about profit in terms of performance, but we haven't always been that focused on what's the most profitable piece of business, and that's definitely a part that that needs to play, particularly in the catering areas where we have much higher costs involved. Taking the most profitable piece of business is incredibly important. And then really looking at those new KPIs, reporting and standards of operation will help to pull everything together in terms of having really accurate knowledge and performance. So how can revenue management make a difference? I just want to show you a very simple example of how knowing all of this information and bringing all of these aspects together can really impact our revenues. If we take a typical hotel boardroom, it might hold possibly about 20 people. This could be a function space in any venue. And I'm going to take an average delegate package of $50 per person. Now, that will vary enormously by region and by type of property, but just for the purpose of this, I'm going to take a very average price of a delegate package of $50 per person, and that would include some food and beverage and a rental a portion. I get an inquiry 30 days out just for 10 people for that boardroom. Now, my boardroom's available and I may decide to take that booking because I'm really not sure what else is going to come. And I have $500 on my books, which I'm very happy with. But closer to the time, I then get another inquiry 15 days out for 12 attendees. I'm still going to charge that same $50 because that's a rate that works for me in the marketplace. But now I can see by just holding out for those couple more attendees, I've actually increased my revenue quite significantly. If I had rejected that booking for 10 people and held out, if I knew that was coming and I was confident about it, then I could drive my revenue. But unfortunately, if I had taken that inquiry for the 10 people, I would now be in the position of probably having to reject those 12 attendees and possibly have lost that additional revenue. And then again, closer to the time, 7 days out, I get another request, this time for 15 people. And again, had I taken that initial inquiry, now I would be having to reject that business. But if I really could see that demand coming, if I knew my demand profile and was confident in the fact that I was going to get that better booking with that larger number of attendees, I could dramatically have increased my revenue opportunity out of that room. So it's really about knowing when business books, understanding those demand profiles and understanding the lead time of bookings and how big those inquiries are. How many attendees can we expect? What is the revenue value of those bookings? So that we know when to confidently make a decision to hold out or to take select the correct booking. Now that's clearly a very tricky thing to do, and we definitely need data in order to be able to make that assessment. But if we focus on selling just a few more people in each of our rooms every day, when we have the opportunity to, when we identify those medium to high demand days, we will dramatically increase our revenues. So how can we go about doing that? Well, there are several aspects of meetings and events data that we can use very practically. You'll just notice there, we can look at things like assessing bookings based on the number of attendees, based on the size of that booking, and look at the appropriate space for that business. We can measure our business by revenue per square meter. Where are we achieving that? How well are we utilizing our space? We can look at booking pace. We can look at lead time. We can focus a lot on our lost and denied business. Very often, it's an area that we don't tend to focus on. We focus on the opportunities, we focus on the business that we've converted, and we focus on the tentatives and the prospects that are still there waiting to be converted. But conveniently often, we don't focus too much on the business that we've lost, and particularly the business that we've denied or turned away. And that's where the opportunity is to really understand our demand and understand how we're selecting the right kind of business and when that is booking. We can track year-on-year changes and build up a trend so that we understand and can better forecast that demand and better forecast when business is likely to come. We can break it down by market segment. And one of the key aspects there is looking at that total demand. So not just going back into the diary and looking previously at what we sold, but looking at what was the total opportunity and adding in all those lost and denied bookings so that we can truly understand our overall demand profile. So that's a good amount of words in terms of the sorts of things that we can do, but how can we practically look at this data? How can we use it in a useful way? So I just want to break down some thoughts about that revenue management cycle for meetings and events, which in many cases is exactly the same as how we approach our rooms management, but with some very subtle differences. So everything starts with trend analysis. Everything starts with collecting that data and analyzing that data and understanding our demand, understanding every single day. With meetings and events, we often tend to cluster months together or be very generic about day of week. And when we actually look at our true demand day by day, we find there are very subtle differences, even one week to another within the same month. And being able to identify those through looking at our historic demand will help us very more accurately forecast the future. We can look at the lead times of our bookings, but most importantly, we need to break that down into size. When do my boardroom bookings come, and when do my ballroom bookings come, and everything in between. So we can need to look at that data and break it down by size and by value. Revenue pace is something we're probably fairly familiar with looking at. Very often the question will always arise, well, what was on the books at the same time last year? Being able to measure that pace and measure how business picks up each week and each month can be very laborious to do manually, but is incredibly important to understand where trends are increasing or where perhaps we're falling behind where we have previously. Booking size for meetings and events is incredibly important. It's the thing that majorly differentiates meetings and event space from bedrooms, because our rooms that hold, for example, 40 people, we could have 12 people in there, or 15 or 20 or 30. So how we sell and utilize that space is very important for driving our revenues, and understanding the demand based on number of attendees will help us do that very effectively. And of course, looking at segmentation, booking types, the different types and styles of business that we get, and the profitability and revenues attached to them. The second stage is then setting our strategy. So using everything that we've learned in all of that data analysis to forecast our demand effectively. So going through day by day and assessing whether a day is going to be high demand or medium or low or distressed, or any category that we care to apply, but really being able to differentiate day by day in a visual yield planner so that everyone in the team is managing and quoting on the same basis. And then in terms of pricing, often what happens with pricing with meetings and events is we set that pricing at the beginning of the year and it stays very static. We need to have dynamic pricing to look not only at our high, medium and low periods, but also to look at which are our most popular spaces. Can we drive more revenue from the rooms that are in much greater demand, and perhaps not be quite so aggressive on our pricing for rooms that we get very few inquiries for? So being able to break that demand profile down will help us with our pricing. And also managing those capacities, so ensuring when we have the opportunity, we really are driving the right number of people in the right space. And then, of course, measuring performance is incredibly important. And I've mentioned already that one of the key things that we focus on is, did we make budget? And unfortunately, within the meetings and events area, that's often the only criteria we have to be able to measure success. But actually looking at things like space utilization, so our occupancy, our attendee density, our revenue per square meter. There are lots of ways that we can measure our effectiveness. And definitely conversion is a great way of measuring the effectiveness of our teams. How well are we converting our revenue, not just our inquiries? So of all the opportunities that we were offered in any particular month, what percentage did we convert, and how can we improve that percentage conversion? It's not about just having a measure, it's about using that as proactive information to say, how can we do it better? And the final area is also looking around at our competitive market. It's great to be able to define our own strategy and look at our own information and set our own demand forecasts. But obviously, we all operate within very competitive markets. So making sure that we have an awareness of what our competitors are doing. Very often, we focus a lot on our competitors' pricing, but we don't always add into that equation what is their quality of product, what are their package inclusions, How nice is their facility? How good is their AV equipment? What's included in those packages? So we shouldn't just be looking necessarily at the price of our competitors, but really understanding the value that they offer compared to our product. So those are some of the key things that help us build that cycle of revenue management within the meetings and events area. And I just want to illustrate how we can practically create some of that information. So demand by day, for example, simply tracking the number of inquiries across each day, each month, to track that total demand. So our definites, our tentatives, our lost, our cancelled, our turnaways, being able to build a demand profile and highlight where those key high demand days are. Very simple way of tracking the information, but it gives us a very clear and precise demand profile that we can build on for the future. So we can identify those key peaks and troughs, see if we have trends that we can rely on going forward, and using that, as I say, as a foundation. The second thing that's very key to understand is demand by size of booking, which again is a fairly simple thing to do. We know on every single booking that we take how many attendees that booking is for. And being able to categorize that together and understand which are our most popular rooms based on the actual size of the inquiries. So you'll see here a selection of 3 months and the categories broken down by number of attendees. So 0 to 10, 11 to 20, and so on up. And by doing that, I can see the popularity of each individual space, therefore potentially which rooms I could be confident charging more for, and which rooms I need either proactive sales focus in order to drive more inquiries for those rooms that I don't have enough demand for, and also look at that pricing profile for each of those areas. We can then turn that into a dynamic selling strategy. So we can look at each individual room and price them accordingly. This is an example of pricing in a delegate package, but the same principle would apply for room rentals, and actually creating different pricing depending on the popularity of the room. Pricing by demand, so by high, by mid, by low, and by distressed. And also setting a minimum capacity so that we're ensuring in those periods of medium and high demand, we're really utilizing that space effectively by making sure that we're getting the right number of people in that room and therefore driving our catering spends, our overall revenue performance. That also creates a minimum revenue threshold, but it's done in the way of looking at number of attendees and price per person, as opposed to simply setting a revenue figure for each room and leaving that as a static figure. So we can perhaps in our periods of high demand drive higher minimums, and obviously they would drop through the lower demand periods. It's also important to measure our performance. So an example of how we might do that is looking at a combination of our function room occupancy, our attendee density, our revenue per person, and also obviously our revenue per square meter, which is not shown on this particular chart. But looking at the relationship of our function room occupancy and our attendee density will help us to understand how well we're using that space. Did we forecast demand correctly? Did we see the right levels of demand coming, and did we take advantage of those high demand periods to drive our performance and increase our attendee numbers and thereby increase our revenue? And one of the final areas really to be able to understand truly our performance is measuring conversion. This is an example of measuring conversion of number of inquiries and conversion of revenue. And as you can see, as this chart illustrates, the conversion of inquiries is often much higher than the conversion of revenue. Mostly if you ask a hotel what their conversion is, they're usually quite happy to tell you their inquiry conversion level, but not so much their revenue conversion level. And sometimes that means they're just missing some of those bigger opportunities and not necessarily converting the bookings that they really want, those high value inquiries. They often get lost somewhere in the mix because they tend to be much longer lead and aren't always the focus of our attention. So are we yielding and are we managing to convert the right inquiries. And by examining that data, again, it allows us to really make a change and do something differently. So we'd just like to have a second poll question, having been through some of those concepts, just to understand if you could change something now from what you're doing already, what would you change in terms of managing your meetings and event space if you could? And a few suggestions there, and you can actually choose more than one. In the first poll, it was one answer only. You can choose multiple answers to this question. So just some fairly, hopefully realistic answers to that question is one, I'd love to do more, but genuinely don't have the time to spend doing all of that analysis. I'd like to have more confidence in my decisions, so happy making decisions, but not necessarily confident always about them. So I'd like to actually develop more confidence in making those decisions. I'd like to be able to measure more than just did we make budget. So looking at some of those key metrics that I've just talked about in terms of our conversion and space utilization. Would you like to measure the effectiveness of the team? So each individual person in the team, how well are they converting business? Where do they perhaps need some more coaching or reward for those key performers in terms of things like revenue conversion? I'd like to implement a better strategy to drive revenue. So having that strategy in place of more accurately forecasting demand and having a dynamic pricing strategy that can take advantage of those demand options. So I can see the results that they're building nicely. We'll just give that a couple of more seconds just to get a few more answers in. There's some great answers coming through. And we have now closed the poll. So thank you very much for that response. I'll give you the results that have come across from the audience. Number one, out in front by quite a long way at 77% is I'd like to implement a better strategy to drive revenue. So definitely desire there to have a more strategic approach to meetings and events management. Our second highest there is 53%. I'd like to measure the effectiveness of my team. So really understand how that work is spread and how each individual team member is playing a part. And then we've got two very similar at 45 and 48% of I'd like to have more confidence and I'd like to measure just more than just budgeted revenue. And it's great to see that the lowest score on the survey at 22% is I would like to do more, but I don't have time. So that's reflecting that time is an issue, but it's certainly not the major issue. And there's definitely a will and a desire to be more strategic and be able to get more from our meetings and events space. Thank you very much for that participation. So how do we begin? Clearly there's a desire and a need to really focus on this very important area of the business. And there's a few things that we can start doing fairly simply. And number one would be to ensure that we have good practice in terms of capturing all of that booking data. So making sure that we're tracking all of the revenues and all of the inquiries in our sales and catering systems, making sure we're tracking all of those bookings that we're denying. I truly understand, having worked in many a meetings office, how it's very frustrating to stop and take 3 or 4 minutes to put a booking into the system that you know isn't going to happen because you've just rejected it. But being able to track that data and understand, particularly in our busiest times when we're denying business, how much opportunity did we have? How many times over could we potentially have filled this space? Making sure that we have all of that revenue data and inquiry data recorded in the system is absolutely the first step to having a very reliable strategy. Secondly, setting some KPIs based on utilization of space and conversion opportunities. So having those key performance indicators of our expectations of functional occupancy and attendee density. revenue per square meter, what's our expectation, and measuring on a monthly basis how well we're coming up to that expectation. Capturing that essential trend data, so starting to create some graphs and charts in terms of lead time, attendee numbers, and really relating those to how we're going to manage the business going forward. Calculate this historic demand trends so that we can use those as a foundation to be able to forecast the future more accurately than we do today. And reviewing those booking lead times and size profiles so that we can really forecast that future demand. So we have a path of how we can do this. One of the things that came out of that very initial poll is not having those tools available. And one of the things that we're really excited to introduce to you today is Smart Space by Ideas. It's one of the systems available, and it's hopefully you'll see that it can provide some of the easy answers and quick answers to some of those questions and some of those challenges that we have in being able to have access to that data and being able to measure our performance. So I would like to take you just a few minutes to show you just a couple of aspects of the system. And hopefully if you would like to see more, we'd be very happy for you to get in touch and give you a much more in-depth view. But just to give you a flavour of the sort of things that are available now, we can have a very quick look at the Smart Space application. And as we come into the Smart Space application, you'll see a dashboard and you'll recognize some of those views. Some of the screenshots that we looked at were an example, and some of those can be done, simply by Excel spreadsheets and pivot tables and so forth, but still a lot of work involved in doing that. With a system like Smart Space, it presents all of that data for you very quickly and simply. So things like booking pace, things like measuring your space utilization, conversion is all very easily presented for you. The system's broken down into those 4 key areas. So trend analysis, looking at all of those trends of business and demand. Strategy setting, where we can set a demand forecast and look at our pricing strategy. Performance, again, looking at those key areas of space utilization and conversion. And a little area for looking at our competitive market value. I just want to touch on and just give you a look and feel of a couple of the key tools within the application. So firstly, under trend analysis, one of the key things that we want to be able to measure is that demand by day. And so we take all of the booking inquiries from the diary system and present them very quickly and easily, and apply some color coding so that the pattern of demand comes out very strongly across the number of inquiries that are taken. So you can see here all the months down the side and days across the top, and that pattern of demand that we have every single day. Another key tool that I just like to pull out is inquiries by month by attendees, as we mentioned. So behind the scenes, all that analysis happening and pulling together all of the inquiries and presenting them to you, depending, and these will very much vary property by property, but providing that profile of business against the actual function rooms and facilities that exist and where the demand exists, and perhaps the pricing opportunities in order to drive revenue. In terms of pace, business pace pickup, for example, being able to look at how business is moving between dates. Just let that load for a second. There we go. Sorry. I was thinking there for a minute I had lost a connection. I think you get the look and feel of Smart Space and some of the things that it can provide. We can also measure that performance and look at conversion. There's areas for setting strategy and providing some great metrics about your meetings and event space. getting into some of that detail of conversion, looking at the number of inquiries we get each month, the value of those inquiries, and how we're managing to convert those inquiries. So that's a very quick look at Smart Space. There's a great deal in it, and as I say, if you would be interested in some further information, we would be very happy to provide some demonstrations. So I'd really like to open up, bring Wayman back in, and ask if we have any questions that hopefully we can answer for you about anything that we've covered today.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And let's get the questions coming in. And if you have anything, please send it to me from the questions section of the control panel. And let's see what we have. So the first question we have is, I like the example you shared. However, our hotel follows a first come, first serve logic. So how do we actually do an accurate forecast?
Really good question. Really good question. And you're not alone. A lot of again, it's that lack of confidence in knowing what demand is coming. And that's where, if you can look at some of your historic data and historic trends and use those to try and predict where those key dates are coming, just as we do with bedrooms or any kind of forecasting, we try and predict where those busy periods of time are going to be, and then be selective on those dates about the business that you're taking. Clearly, within meetings, there are in a lot of areas and a lot of regions, there isn't enough demand to consistently fill all of our space. So all of the time, you're not going to be aggressively rejecting inquiries, but it's about identifying those key times, those key weeks, or even key days when you know that demand is building, and you can see, looking at all of that, lost business, cancelled business, and so forth, understand which are your most popular days, and then start to be a little bit more selective about the business that you take.
Yep, thank you, Heather. We have a few questions on the integration. So does Smart Space integrate with ideas and take the demand into effect? And also, what kind of sales and catering system does it integrate with, like Delphi or Oracle's sales and catering system?
Sure, fantastic. So Smart Space today works with Delphi and Delphi FDC and Opera Sales and Catering. But one of the key things to establish is we don't interface with those with any diary management systems. The way that we operate is to take a data extract. So we take a nightly data extract, and that data is then imported into Smart Space and populates all of those tools throughout the application. So we can work with other systems as well. We have got in development at the moment with 3 or 4 different systems the writing of that data extract. And so it's very compatible with certainly the market leading diary management systems, and possibly many others as well. In terms of the integration with ideas, at the moment, it does stand alone. And one of the key things is there is no, which is very different, those of you who are very familiar with the revenue management systems of ideas, there are no automated analytics. So one of the reasons that that Smart Space has come into the ideas family is to be able to develop the whole meetings and events product in a much more sophisticated way. So that will come at some point in the future, but Smart Space as it stands alone today is really providing a view. It's a visualization tool and a strategy tool for the user to see all of that data, which really hasn't been accessible before, and be able to make your own decisions in terms of forecasting demand. So currently there's no integration with the RMS, but it really is about finding that balance between the room's demand and the room strategy, and the meetings and events space demand and strategy.
Yep, thank you, Heather. And the next question we have is, can this also measure by manager or owning hotels meeting space overall?
Smart Space itself can measure within conversion. We do break down by individual sales manager. So we can look at the conversion, the inquiry levels that each individual team member is handling, and how they are converting their business. And it's great. We've seen this work very successfully where there's a little competition every month as to who can drive the best revenue conversion. Often it's not fair when you look at performance based on revenue, because there will always be people who get to deal with the really big important bookings, and other people who are perhaps more junior who deal with the smaller events. But if you look at the conversion level, the percentage level, it's a great leveler, and it means everybody has a chance to really perform well in terms of converting that revenue that they're handling. So there are elements of the system absolutely that we can see by individual team member.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. How would your product present the information for a hotel of 25 function rooms with varied size?
We do have some hotels with that many function rooms live currently. The displays are certainly very generic. One of the things that so it would absolutely handle that kind of capacity. And because we can look at that demand by number of attendees, it helps you to see exactly the demand by each of those function spaces. Often we get asked, do we look at demand by actual function room? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is the person who's handling the inquiry very often has a lot of flexibility as to which room they use. It may be the last room that's available, it may be that it's the client's favorite room, it may be it's the room that's easiest to sell. But until you look at the actual number of attendees on a booking, you can't really establish whether that's true demand for that actual function space. So we work on the basis of the optimal capacity of every individual room, however many you have, and look at the demand that you actually have for that space, so that you can then make more effective decisions about which are the right bookings to take, and which perhaps are bookings that you might want to reject. When we look at occupancy, currently we look at occupancy for the entire property. We don't currently look at occupancy by room, but that's absolutely in our development plan to do.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. From where is the competitive market data obtained?
Great question. We don't automatically, as you'll know, it's very difficult to get hold of good competitive data, but we do find that most hotels still make those sort of monthly competitor calls to gauge pricing. But again, it's very focused on pricing. So what we wanted to do was create something whereby we can look at that pricing, but also take into account the quality of product of the competitor. So it is something that hotel manually derives. We don't draw that data from anywhere in particular, because it's very difficult to get consistent data for competitor sets. So it is something that's created by the hotel, but it allows you to track that information and stay on top of that information and compare the quality of the product and different aspects of the quality of the product to the prices that are on offer, and it allows you to track therefore any changes in pricing and any changes in product across your competitive set that you might not otherwise be aware of.
Yep, thank you, Heather. There's another question is, I would like to ask if Smart Space would be able to break down the utilization by each individual meeting room. Seems to me it's an overall performance.
That's correct. At this stage, it is an overall performance. We are looking at that development of actually being able to see which rooms are the most popular and looking at revenue yield and occupancy and so forth by individual function room. One of the things that I'm working with hotels for many years in looking at meeting space and conference centers likewise, I've often heard the comment that, for example, my general manager asked me to for an occupancy report, and it took me 3 days to put it together. And so it's one of those things that we started at a simple basis of being able to look at occupancy and more importantly, attendee density for the entire property. And then the next level of breakdown would be to look at that by individual function room. So absolutely, you're right, you spotted. We don't at the moment break that down by individual function room, but of course that data is available and could be broken down that way.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And the next question is there a function to indicate key or major citywide event dates to highlight peak periods in the city?
Yes, absolutely. So in the demand forecast, which I didn't show you in detail, obviously the bit that we looked at shows you all the historic demand, but then you go ahead and forecast demand. And in that area where you build that demand forecast, there is an area to be able to highlight events and put events in there and compare year on year, for example, when events move or perhaps a biannual events. So yes, that can be highlighted in the system.
Yep. And is EBMS one of the diary system we work with?
It is actually. In the UK, we have 8 properties currently that work with EBMS. It is a system we're familiar with, and we can get a data extract from them, yes.
Yep, that's great. And we have another question is, thanks for the commentation. Smart Space looks like a fantastic visualization tool. One problem with our hotels is that the data accuracy of our sales and catering system, as this seems like a predecessor of Smart Space. Is there any guidelines or process for the standardization of data input process so that it can be visualized by Smart Space?
We take anything that's in the system. So however you track business by market segment or booking type, or for those that use Delphi by meeting class, we take all of those codes. Now, obviously, they are only as useful as the accuracy of the data that's in the sales and catering system. But what a lot of our clients have found already is that it's a great step, it's a great catalyst to cleaning up that process, because once you can visualize that data, it's very easy to see where things are either miscoded or revenue is missing, or it helps in that process of cleaning up your system. So it isn't really a question. I had this conversation with someone the other day. It's not a question really of waiting until you've cleaned up the system. Actually, a system like SmartSpace, or even once you start looking at your own data to try and forecast demand and put some of these metrics together, is you start to see where those errors are, and it's the catalyst to then go ahead and fix some of them. Because the system does not make predictive, doesn't have predictive analytics, it is less reliant on the accuracy of that data. Of course, you would be making decisions based on that data, but it's less critical than having the predictive analytics, which absolutely relies on accurate data.
Yeah.
So the visualization helps in the cleanup process. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And the next question we have is, will you solve the challenge of metrics by meeting rooms when there are flexible meeting space, such as a ballroom can be sold as one space or broken into 2 separate spaces?
Yes. Yes, one of my favorite topics, and one of the age-old discussions of how do we measure occupancy. And I've seen many management teams grapple with this in terms of how we kind of made a decision as to how we saw it, and it's really about the opportunity. So one of the key things that we measure, if you take that example as what I would term a parent room, and then the subsections that it breaks down into. If you think about the ballroom, the most effective way of selling the ballroom is not broken down into sections, because you can get more people in it without it broken down. As soon as you start putting those sections in place, you lose capacity. So the way that we've chosen to look at occupancy is really focusing on that parent space, and then measure any of those child rooms or subsections. Anything that happens in any of those rooms are accredited to the parent space. So just to give you a very quick example of that, let's say the ballroom holds 300 people. If it breaks down into 3 sections, you can no longer do 300 people. If you, for example, in one section, that's all that was left on one day, and there were 60 people in that one section, we look at the utilization of the whole ballroom and say that we had 60 people actually in a space that holds 300. And then we look at the revenue from that individual event against the entire opportunity for the ballroom. So it's really looking at the utilization of that space as opposed to percentages, because one of the challenges that you get into, particularly with rooms that break into 3 or 4 sections, is all the multiples of those sections, because there's A and B and there's A and B and C and so on. So we've tried to keep it simple but effective in terms of understanding within any 24-hour period the utilization of that space and what did we yield from that space.
Thank you, Heather. Due to time constraint, we'll just ask one last question. So can you take extracts from both Delphi and EBMS? Our property use both systems.
Wow. I would like to come back to you on that. We have not had that scenario yet where we would take 2 feeds from 2 different diary management systems into one property. So I need to just review that a little bit, and perhaps we can pick that up. Women, do we if we could get the contact of that person to come back to you with an answer, that would be great.
Yeah, we have the contact, so we'll email you after the live session.
Great.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much to everyone for the great questions and great response from the audience. Lots of questions going on at the back end. And thank you very much, Heather, for sharing your experience and also sharing with us Smart Space product details. So on behalf of Ideas, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today, and hopefully this session has been useful for you. We will send out the recording as a YouTube video next week. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And Heather has put her email address here as a contact. So thanks again for attending and have a great day.